On the morning of the 8th of September, my wife of 48 years stood in our kitchen and begged me to sell our house. She had a pen in her hand. She said the word please 4 times. 61 minutes later, I went out to move the car, and she came after me barefoot into the rain. She went down on both knees on the wet driveway. She took hold of my coat with both hands and begged me not to sell it. In her right fist, folded and damp, was a piece of paper she would not let me see. They had built the whole thing on one assumption about me, and it was wrong. My name is Silas Redmond. I am 73. For 41 years I was a court stenographer at the Aubrey County Courthouse, paid to write down exactly what people said. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments what town you are watching from tonight. I like knowing who is out there. If stories like this one matter to you, hit the like button and subscribe, and stay with me, because this one takes a while to come apart. To understand what happened on that driveway, you have to go back 11 days, to the last ordinary morning we had. We live at 1114 Bellamy Street in New Perth, Ohio, in a 2-story frame house with a wraparound porch that my father-in-law helped me shingle in 1979. I have replaced that roof twice since. The house has 11 windows on the front elevation and a crack in the basement slab shaped like the state of Illinois. And I know both of those things because I am the sort of man who counts. My wife's name is Nell. She is 71. She taught piano in our front room for 34 years. $3 a lesson when she started, 22 when she stopped. And there are men and women in this county in their 40s who still cannot hear a scale without sitting up straighter. The last ordinary morning was Friday, the 28th of August. I remember it because I timed my coffee wrong and drank it cold. Nell came down at 7 in her blue robe and stood at the window over the sink, looking at the driveway, and she asked me a question she had never asked in 48 years. She asked me what the house was worth. I said I supposed 300 and something. I said Emil across the street got $391 for his sister's place on Coburn, and ours has the bigger lot. She said nothing for a while. Then she said, "That much," in a small voice, the way you would say a diagnosis out loud to see how it sounded. I did not think about it again for a week. That is the part I have had to make peace with. Here is what I should have seen. Nell had stopped answering the phone in front of me. Not always, just sometimes. It would ring, and she would look at the screen and set it face down on the arm of the chair and let it go. And then 20 minutes later, I would hear her talking low in the laundry room, with the dryer running. She had lost weight I had not asked about. She had started sleeping on top of the covers, dressed, like a woman expecting to be called out in the night. And on the 3rd of September, she flinched when the doorbell rang. My wife, who has walked to the door of that house for half a century without breaking stride, put her hand flat on the wall and stood still until the mail carrier drove off. I want to say something here, and I want to say it plainly, because it is the shape of everything that came after. When a woman you have loved for that long starts acting like a stranger, there are 2 things you can decide. You can decide something is wrong with her, or you can decide something is being done to her. I picked the wrong one first. I picked it for 11 days. Every man watching this, who has ever explained his wife's behavior to himself, instead of asking her about it, knows what that costs. Now, the 8th of September, Tuesday. Rain since 4 in the morning. The steady kind that comes in off the lake and stays all day. I came down at 10 to 8, and there was a man sitting at my kitchen table. He was young, maybe 38, in a quarter-zip sweater, with a real estate company's logo stitched over the heart. He had a leather folder open in front of him, and a laptop and 2 pens set out parallel, and he stood up fast when he saw me, and put his hand out, and said his name was Kip Danner, and he was sorry for the hour. Nell was at the counter with her back to me, making coffee she was not going to drink. I asked what this was. Kip Danner looked at Nell. Nell did not turn around. He looked back at me and he said, in a careful voice that a young man uses when he has walked into the middle of something, that Mrs. Redmond had called his office on Friday about a listing. I said, "A listing of what?" He said, "Of the house, sir. I have sat through 4,000 hearings. I know the sound of a room where one person knows something and the others do not. My kitchen made that sound." Nell turned around then. She had her hands wrapped around the coffee pot handle, and she was holding it the way you hold a rail. She said, "Silas, sit down. I want you to hear him out." So I sat down, because after 48 years you sit down. Kip Danner talked for 11 minutes. I timed it, because I time things, because for 4 decades, my hands did nothing all day but keep pace with other people's mouths. He said, the market in New Perth was soft and getting softer. He said there were 9 listings on the east side, and 3 of them had been sitting since spring. He said a 2-story frame with a wraparound porch and original wiring was what the trade called a project, and that projects were selling at a discount right now. He said he could put it up at $249, and that would be optimistic. Then he said the part he had come to say. He said there was already an interested party, a firm out of Canton that buys older homes in the county for cash, no inspection, no financing contingency, closing in as little as 15 days. He said they had made a preliminary number. I asked what the number was. He turned the folder around and slid it across the table. $214,000. I looked at that figure for a long moment. Then I looked at the line above it. Because when you have spent your life transcribing documents, your eye does not go to the money first. It goes to the names. The buyer line was already filled in. Not blank, not to be determined, not a space for an offer to be entered later. Typed, in the same font as the rest of the form, 3 days before I ever heard about it. Meridian Anchor LLC. And under that, in the box for the anticipated closing date, someone had typed the 17th of October. I have signed and initialed and stamped more real estate documents than I could count, sitting 3 feet from judges who were unwinding them. I know what a listing agreement is. It is a contract to try to find a buyer. It is a fishing license. It is not supposed to arrive with the fish already in the boat, named, with a date. I asked Kip Danner how a listing agreement comes pre-populated with a buyer. He got red across the throat. He said the referral came in that way, from the client's family advisor, and he had assumed it was a private arrangement they wanted papered. I asked which family advisor. Nell set the coffee pot down hard enough that the burner rattled. She said, "Silas, please, just sign it, please." That was the first please. I said, "Nell, who is Meridian Anchor?" She said, "I don't know. It doesn't matter. It's a good number. It's cash. Please." That was the second. I said, "We are not selling this house." And my wife, who once drove 4 hours through an ice storm to sit in a hospital hallway with a student's mother she had met twice, who has never in her life asked me for anything she did not need, put both hands on the kitchen table and leaned toward me and said, "Please, Silas, please, I am asking you for one thing. Sell the house." 4. There is a certain quality a voice gets. I do not have a good word for it even now, and I have spent my life finding words for the sounds people make. It is not fear exactly. It is the sound of somebody who has already run out of options and is reciting the last one. Kip Danner stood up and said, maybe he should come back another time. Nobody answered him. He let himself out, and then the driveway. Here is what happened in those 61 minutes, as best as I have been able to reconstruct it since, and I have reconstructed it many times. At 8:31, I went upstairs. I did not slam anything. I sat on the edge of our bed for a while and looked at the water running down the window. At about 8:40, Nell's phone rang downstairs. I heard her answer it in the laundry room. I heard the dryer come on, empty, the way it had been coming on for 2 weeks. The call lasted, I would learn later, 4 minutes and 9 seconds. At about 9, I heard the printer in the den. At 9:16, I came down, took my keys off the hook, said nothing, and went out to move the car up under the carport so the rain would stop coming in the driver's window, which has a seal I have been meaning to replace since March. And my wife came out of that house without shoes. She had come out so fast that the storm door banged twice behind her. The rain had made the driveway dark and slick, and she came down it at a half run, and about 4 feet from me, her legs went, and she did not so much kneel as arrive on her knees, hard, on the concrete. I heard it. I will hear it for the rest of my life. She got hold of the front of my coat with both fists and pulled herself in against me and said, "Don't sell it. Silas, don't sell it. Don't sign anything. Don't put your name on one piece of paper. Not for him, not for anybody, not ever." I said, "Nell, an hour ago you were begging me to." She said, "I was wrong." I said, "Wrong about what?" And she pressed her forehead into my chest and would not answer. I got her up. Her knees were scraped and bleeding a little through her slacks, and she did not seem to know it. I got her back in the house and sat her on the bench in the mudroom, and knelt down and took her feet in my hands. And they were white and freezing, and there was a piece of gravel stuck to the ball of her left foot. I picked it off. She let me, and the whole time she kept her right hand closed in a fist against her stomach. I said, "What's in your hand?" She said, "Nothing." I said, "Nell." She said, "Nothing, Silas," and her voice broke on it. "It's nothing. Please don't. 50 years of marriage teaches you where the wall is." I could have taken her wrist. She weighs 109 pounds, and I could have opened her hand like a walnut. I want every man watching to understand why I did not. Because whatever was in that fist, she had decided it was worse for me to see it than for her to kneel in the rain. And if I had forced it, I would have proven to her, in that moment, that she had been right to keep things from me. So I let it go. I let it go for 14 more days. That is my share of this. I will carry it. What I did instead was start writing. I want to explain this, because it is going to matter later, and because it is the only thing I had. When I came out of the service in 1972, I could not get into a trade, and I could not afford school, and a woman named Odessa Rooker, who ran the reporter's office at the courthouse, told me I had fast hands and no opinions, which was the whole job description. She taught me machine shorthand. I sat in the well of that courtroom for 41 years, with a steno machine between my knees, taking down every word said by every liar, every widow, every drunk, every judge, at 230 words a minute. I do not remember conversations the way most people do. I do not remember the gist. I take the words, and when I retired, I did not stop. I have a shelf in the den with 11 years of narrow spiral steno pads on it, because writing down what people say is what my hands do when I am worried. That Tuesday night, after Nell went up, I sat at the desk in the den, and I took down the whole day from memory. Kip Danner's 11 minutes. The 4 pleases. Every word on that driveway. I dated it, and I timed it, and I initialed the bottom of the page, the way I did for 4 decades, and I did not know then that I had just started the record that would end all of it. Wednesday morning, she was different. That is the cruel part. She came down at 7 and made French toast, and asked me if I had remembered to call about the gutters, and when I brought up the house, she looked at me with an expression I can only call performed and said, "Oh, that. I got carried away. Marie down at the church has been talking about a condominium in Naples, and I got carried away." "Forget it," I said. And Kip Danner sitting at our table at 8 in the morning with a buyer already typed in. She said, "I don't want to talk about it anymore, Silas." And she said it in a way that closed a door. So I started somewhere else. I started where a man like me always starts, with the paper. That afternoon, I drove down to the Aubrey County Courthouse. I have not worked in that building since 2014, but I still park in the same spot, and the security officer at the west door is a man named Gustav Pell, whose mother I went to high school with, and he waved me around the scanner, the way he always does. The recorder's office is on the 2nd floor, at the end of the marble hall, and behind the counter that day was a woman named Ruth Ann Spratt, who ran records for 30 years, and who came back 2 days a week after her husband passed, because, in her words, she was not going to sit in a house and dust. Ruth Ann knows that building the way I know a transcript. I asked her to pull anything filed against 1114 Bellamy. She typed for a minute. Then she said, "Nothing new, Silas. Mortgage satisfied in '09. That's the last thing on it." I asked her to run a name. Meridian Anchor, LLC, I said. She ran it. She got 9 hits in Aubrey County. 9 properties, all conveyed over the last 3 years, all of them on the older streets. Coburn, Delahunt, Bellamy, 6th. She turned the monitor, and I looked at the list, and I did not understand yet what I was looking at. But I copied every address and every instrument number into a steno pad in my own shorthand, and Ruth Ann watched me do it and said, in a dry voice, "You always did make people nervous with that thing." I asked her who filed them. She scrolled. She said, "Same submitter on all 9. Cardinal Title and Escrow, over on Quarry Road." And I sat down on the wooden bench outside the recorder's office. And I put my hands on my knees, because Cardinal Title and Escrow is where my daughter works. I need to tell you about my children now. Our son is Bram. He is 42. He installs commercial refrigeration in Tucson, and he calls his mother every Sunday at 4 o'clock, and has since he was 19. He is a good man who is 2,000 miles away, and for most of this story, that is all you need to know about him. Our daughter is Dinah. She is 46. She has her mother's hands and my temperament, which is a hard combination for a woman, and she has been an escrow officer at Cardinal Title for 11 years. She is good at it. She closes 400 files a year, and she has never had a claim. When she was 29, she married a man named Trace Cobb, and they have 1 child, Junie, who is 8, and who is the reason I still know how to sit on a floor. Trace Cobb. I will try to be fair about him, because a transcript is fair or it is nothing. He is 47. He is tall, he has a good handshake, and he remembers the name of every person he has ever been introduced to, which is a skill I have watched him use, the way a man uses a tool. He came out of 2 years at a state school, and 8 years selling annuities, and about 6 years ago, he started a company called Fairhaven Legacy Partners, which he describes at family dinners as helping seniors transition with dignity. He wears half glasses he does not need. He has a gray Tahoe he washes on Saturdays. He calls me Chief. I have never liked him. I want to be honest that I never liked him, so you can weigh everything I say against that. But not liking a man, and knowing what he is, are different rooms in the same house. And for 6 years, I was in the first one. I drove home from the courthouse the long way, out past the fairgrounds, and I made myself think it through like a record. 9 houses, all old, all bought by an entity nobody in New Perth had heard of, all papered by the company where my daughter works, and a listing agreement on my own kitchen table with the buyer typed in 3 days before anyone told me. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern with a hole in the middle of it, and the hole was my wife. Thursday, the 10th of September, I did something I am not proud of. I searched my wife's things. I waited until she left for her Thursday morning at St. Casimir's, where she has played the little upright in the palliative wing for 9 years, and then I went upstairs and stood in our bedroom doorway for about a minute and a half, arguing with myself, and lost. I started with the nightstand. 3 paperbacks, a tube of hand cream, a rosary she does not use, and her pill organizer. Nell has a heart. I should have said that already. She has a mitral valve that has been leaking since 2022, and what that means in plain language is that a flap inside her heart no longer closes all the way, so a portion of every beat goes backward instead of forward. It makes her tired. It makes her ankles swell in August. For 4 years, her cardiologist, a woman named Ines Barzagar, has managed it with 2 medications, and the promise that when it got bad enough, we would repair it surgically. And in June, it got bad enough. The repair was scheduled for the 21st of October at St. Casimir's Regional. We had known that date since the middle of July. There was a magnet holding the pre-op sheet on our refrigerator. The organizer is one of those long plastic ones, 4 compartments a day, 7 days across. Morning, noon, evening, bedtime. Every morning compartment was full and correct. Every noon compartment was empty and clean. Every evening compartment had 1 pill in it where there should have been 2. I stood there and did the arithmetic, which is the only kind of praying I know how to do. Her diuretic is the noon one. Her second evening pill is the one that keeps her rhythm even. She had been taking, at most, half of what Dr. Barzagar had told her to take, and she had been doing it for long enough to have a system. Then I opened the drawer under the bed, where she keeps her mother's things. Her mother's ring was gone. It is a small ring. It is not a valuable ring. It is a thin yellow gold band with a garnet in it that Nell's mother wore from 1948 until the day she died in our back bedroom in 1997, and Nell has never worn it and has never once considered selling it, and in its place, folded into the velvet slot where the ring goes, was a pawn ticket from Gore Sloan and Jewelry on 5th Street, $640. Dated the 11th of August. I sat down on the floor of my own bedroom with a pawn ticket in my hand. My wife, who has never in 48 years spent $1 without telling me, had sold her mother's ring for $640 and was rationing her heart medication in a house with no mortgage on it, with $11,000 in a savings account she has her own name on, which meant she was not short of money. She was hiding an expense, and whatever it was, she was paying it with anything that would not show on a statement I could see. I put everything back exactly as it had been. I have handled evidence my whole working life, and I put it back with the pawn ticket, at the same angle, in the same slot. Then I went downstairs and photographed nothing and wrote everything down, because a steno pad does not sync to anything and does not need a password. That afternoon I walked across the street to see Emil Bogdan. Emil is 79. He came out of Romania in 1968 with a suitcase and a trade, and he was a machinist at Van Hoos Tool for 31 years, and he has the loudest opinions and the softest heart on Bellamy Street. 2 years ago, somebody backed into his mailbox and left, so he bought one of those doorbell cameras, and then, because Emil does not do anything halfway, a second camera on a bracket over his garage that watches the whole street. I asked him how far back it kept. He said it kept 60 days if you paid the $6, and he paid the $6. I asked him if I could look at his driveway. I said it in a way that let him say no. Emil looked at me for a while. Then he said, "Silas, I have been going to ask you something for a month, and I did not want to be the old woman on the street." I said, "Ask me." He said, "Is Nell all right?" I said, "I don't know." He said, "Come inside." We sat at his kitchen table for 2 hours, with a laptop between us and a plate of those hard almond cookies his wife used to make, and that he now buys from a bakery in Canton, and pretends he does not. And Emil scrolled backward through 60 days of Bellamy Street. A gray Tahoe. Trace Cobb's Tahoe in my driveway on the 11th of August, on the 18th, on the 25th, on the 1st of September, and back through July to the middle of the month. 8 times in the 60 days Emil's camera had kept, and every one of them on a Tuesday, between 1 and 3 in the afternoon. I am at the Canton VA on Tuesday afternoons. I have been for 6 years. I sit with men who are older than me, in a room with bad carpet, and I take down their oral histories for the County Historical Society, verbatim, because a lot of them have nobody else who will write it down. Everyone in my family knows where I am on Tuesday afternoon. It is the most predictable 3 hours of my week. Emil paused the video on the 11th of August. That was the day of the pawn ticket. The Tahoe pulled in at 1:04 in the afternoon. It pulled out at 2:51. And in between, at about 1:30, my front door opened, and my wife came out onto the porch and stood there, with her arms folded across herself, and Trace Cobb came out behind her and stood too close, and they talked for about 90 seconds, and then he put his hand flat on the middle of her back, and Nell stepped away from it fast, like off a hot stove. The camera has no sound. I would have given a year of my life for sound. Emil sat back and said a word in Romanian, and then said, "I am sorry, Silas." I said, "Don't be sorry. Can you copy these?" He copied every clip onto a thumb drive, and he wrote the dates and times on a piece of notebook paper in his careful engineer's printing, and he signed and dated the paper at the bottom without my asking, and when I looked up at him, he shrugged and said, 31 years in a union shop, you learn." That night I sat in the den with a thumb drive and a pawn ticket and a pill organizer full of gaps. And here is where I made my first real mistake, and I want you to watch me make it, because I have watched myself make it 100 times since. I decided I knew what it was. I decided that Trace Cobb was leaning on my wife to sell the house, that Kip Danner and Meridian Anchor were the pipeline, that Cardinal Title was the plumbing, and that if I could break one link, the whole thing would come apart. Simple, clean, a man doing a bad thing in a small town. I was right about almost every fact, and wrong about the shape of them. I thought I was watching a man try to take a house. For the next 3 weeks, I ran hard in that direction, and it cost my wife more than my silence had. Sunday, the 13th of September, we went to dinner at Dinah and Trace's. They live out on Wistman Road in a house with a 3-car garage and a lawn that gets treated 4 times a year. Nell did not want to go. She said she was tired. I said Junie would be disappointed, which was true, and which I used, and she got in the car. Junie met us at the door. She is 8, and she has a gap in her front teeth. She will not have much longer, and she runs at her grandmother like a small dog every single time. And Nell went down on one knee to catch her, and I watched my wife's whole face come back for about 4 seconds, and then go away again. Trace shook my hand in the hall and said, "Chief." He always says chief. He says it the way you would pat a dog you did not own. Dinner was pot roast. Junie told a long story about a substitute teacher. Dinah asked her mother about the surgery, and Nell said the 21st, and Dinah said good, and put her hand over her mother's hand on the table, and Nell looked down at their 2 hands, like she was reading something. After, while Nell and Junie were at the piano in the front room, picking out a duet with 4 wrong notes in it, I helped my daughter carry plates. I said, "Dinah, does Cardinal do closings for an outfit called Meridian Anchor?" She was rinsing a plate. She did not stop rinsing it. She said, "We do closings for everybody, Dad." I said, 9 in 3 years out of 1 office is not everybody. She turned the water off then, and stood with her back to me for a second, and I watched her shoulders set. When she turned around, she had a face on that I had not seen since she was 17, and lying about a car. She said, "Where did you get that?" I said, "From the public record on the 2nd floor of the courthouse where I worked for 41 years. She said, "Dad, please don't." That was the 5th please of the month, and I had started counting them. I said, "Your mother was on her knees in the rain on Tuesday morning, begging me not to sell my house." And my daughter's face did something then that I could not read at the time and have thought about every day since. It was not surprise. It was worse than surprise. It was a woman hearing a thing she had been afraid of hearing, and being relieved that it was only that. She said, "Mom's been under a lot of stress about the operation." I said, "That is not an answer." She said, "It's the only one I've got," and she picked up the plates and went past me. On the way out, Trace walked us to the car with an umbrella, holding it over Nell and not over me, and at the passenger door he said, "Easy now," and took her elbow. Nell said, "I'm fine." He said, "Humor me." And then, to me, over the roof of the car, in the pleasantest voice you ever heard, he said, "Chief, I've been meaning to sit down with you two anyway. Fairhaven does a free legacy review for families. Takes 90 minutes. There's a lot of people your age leaving money on the table." I said, "We're not leaving anything anywhere." He laughed, like I had made a joke, and said, "That's what everybody says, right up until the day they can't say anything." I want you to hear that sentence the way I heard it, standing in the rain with my hand on a car door. At the time I filed it as a salesman being crude. It was not that. It was a man telling me the plan to my face, in a form he knew I could not use, which is a thing I have since learned he did constantly and enjoyed. Nell did not speak for the first 4 miles. Then she said, out of nothing, "Do you remember when I couldn't find the car?" I said, "At the food liner." She said, "Yes. 14 months before this, on a hot Saturday in July, my wife had come out of the food liner on Delahunt with 2 bags of groceries and had not been able to find our car, or the exit, or, for about 20 minutes, the name of the street she lived on. A stock boy sat with her on the bench by the propane cage until she could tell him our number. By the time I got there, she was herself, embarrassed and shaking. Dr. Barzagar ran her through everything and told us it was almost certainly a small event related to her heart, that the imaging was clean and that it had not repeated. It never did repeat. Not once in 14 months. Nell said. In the car. In the dark. I've never been so afraid in my life as I was on that bench. I said. It was 20 minutes, and it never came back. She said. That's not what I was afraid of. And she turned her face to the window, and that was the whole conversation. I got out my pad that night and wrote it down verbatim, and I underlined, "That's not what I was afraid of," and I sat and looked at the underline for a long time without understanding it. Monday the 14th. I went to see the bank. Aubrey County Savings and Trust has been on the corner of 5th and Market since before I was born, and it is now owned by a holding company in Cincinnati, but the people in it are still the people. The teller I wanted was a young woman named Lorna Pike, 34, who is also a notary and who does most of the branch's signings, and who had been in Nell's beginner class in 1998 and could not get her left hand to behave. I did not ask her anything I should not have. I want that on the record. I asked her one question, and I asked it as a customer about my own household. I said, "Lorna, if a person wanted to know whether a wire had ever come into our joint account from a title company, who would they ask?" She pulled it up. She said, "No incoming wires on the joint account in 3 years, Mr. Redmond." I said, "Thank you." And then Lorna Pike did something that I think about every time somebody tells me that nobody in a small town looks out for anybody anymore. She did not say a word about any account that was not mine. But she looked at the screen for another second, and then she looked at me, and she said, "Mr. Redmond, can I ask you something as a person, and not as the bank?" I said, "Yes," she said. "Is Mrs. Redmond doing okay? Because she's been in here 4 times since June, and every time she's brought somebody with her, and she never used to bring anybody." I asked who. She said, "I'm not allowed to say." Then she straightened a stack of deposit slips that did not need straightening and said, "He drives a gray truck." That's all I can tell you. I drove home and sat in the driveway with the engine off, and I could feel it. The way you can feel weather coming in a bad knee. Something large and organized was standing very close to my family, and I could not see the outline of it. Tuesday, I did not go to the VA. I told Nell I was going. I kissed her at the door at 12:40 and drove to the end of Bellamy and parked in the gravel lot behind the Lutheran church, where you can see the whole street through the hedge. And I sat there, with a pair of birding binoculars I have owned since 1989, and a steno pad on my knee. At 1:11, the gray Tahoe came up Bellamy and turned into my driveway. He was inside my house for 1 hour and 40 minutes. When he came out, he was carrying a manila envelope that he had not gone in with, and he stopped on my porch, and thumbed through it in the sunlight, and then he tapped it twice against his palm, and he was smiling. I gave it 20 minutes after he was gone. Then I drove home and came in through the back and found Nell in the front room with the piano lid down, sitting on the bench doing nothing at all. I said, "How was your day?" She said, "Quiet." I said, "Anybody come by?" And my wife of 48 years, who once made me drive back to a diner in Zanesville because she had underpaid by $1.10, looked at me and said, "No." I went out to the garage and stood in there for a while, with my hands on the workbench. Wednesday, the 16th, I took the list of 9 addresses and I drove them. I had copied them off Ruth Ann's screen. 4 on Coburn, 2 on Delahunt, 1 on 6th, 1 on Vassar Court, 1 on Bellamy. That last one stopped me for a second, until I checked the number and saw it was 1149, the Kirkendall place, 4 doors down and across. 3 of the 9 were empty. Not for sale, not boarded, just empty, with the grass cut short by somebody who did not care about it, and a gray lockbox on the front door. The Kirkendall place was one of them. Otis Kirkendall taught shop at New Perth High for 30 years. His wife had died in the spring, and I had assumed, the way you assume about a man of 81, that he had gone to his daughter in Delaware. 5 of the 9 had people in them, and those people were old, and every one of those houses had the same thing on the porch. A printed notice, in a clear plastic sleeve, tacked to the doorframe at eye level. At 418 Coburn, a woman was loading a car. She was about my age, maybe a little older, wearing a windbreaker over a nightgown at 2 in the afternoon, and she was trying to get a floor lamp into the back seat of a Buick, and she was not going to manage it. I parked and got out and asked if I could take the other end. Her name was Cleo Tunney. Her husband is Wardell Tunney, who drove a school bus in this county for 26 years, and who by then was 80, and using a walker, and sitting in the passenger seat of the Buick, with the door open and his feet on the driveway. We got the lamp in. Then Cleo Tunney sat down on her own front steps and started to cry, and I sat down next to her, because I have learned that you do not stand over a crying person. It took her 20 minutes to tell it, and I got all of it, because I asked her to slow down twice, and because I wrote it in the car afterward while it was warm. 3 years ago, a man came to their church supper and gave a talk about legacy. Nice man. Remembered everybody's name. Wardell had had his first stroke, and the medical was eating them, and this man sat with them at their own kitchen table for 3 hours over 3 visits and explained a program. They would sell the house to a partner fund. Not at market, he told them, because there was no financing and no inspection and no waiting, and that discount was the price of certainty. In exchange, they would sign a lifetime right to remain. They would live in that house until they died, at a fixed monthly amount, and they would never be moved, and the equity that would otherwise sit locked in the walls would be released to pay for Wardell's care. Cleo Tunney said, and I am quoting her, "We thought we were being smart. We thought we were the ones being smart for once." They signed in 2023. They got, she said, $41,000, which she was told was the equity after fees, and the rest went into what the man called a reserve. For 2 years, the monthly amount was $510, and nothing happened. Then in March, the amount went to $980. Then in June, it went to $1,400. She called the number and got a voicemail in Canton. In July, a company she had never heard of sent a letter saying the property was under new servicing, and on the 24th of August, a deputy came to the door with a notice, and Cleo Tunney went to a lawyer in Canton with a shoebox, and that lawyer looked at her lifetime, right to remain for about 90 seconds, and asked her one question. He asked her if it had been recorded. She said, "What does that mean?" And I sat on that step with my heart going, because I knew exactly what it meant, and it is a thing so simple that it does not sound like a crime. A deed gets recorded, it goes to the courthouse, it gets stamped and indexed and put in a book, and from that moment, it is true against the whole world. A side agreement that never goes to the courthouse is a piece of paper between 2 people. If one of those people sells the property to somebody else, the new owner takes it free of anything he did not have notice of. Cleo and Wardell Tunney's lifetime right to remain in their own home had been signed and witnessed and given to them in a folder with a gold seal on it, and it had never been carried up those marble stairs, and so in the eyes of the law, it did not exist. They were not owners. They had not been owners since 2021. They were month-to-month tenants of a company in Canton, and the company had raised the rent until they could not pay it, and now they were leaving. I asked her the name of the man from the church supper. She said she had it somewhere, and went in and came back out with a business card in a Ziploc bag, which told me everything about how much she had already been through. Fairhaven Legacy Partners. 9 words of a mission statement, and a name. I did not react. 41 years in a courtroom is good for exactly one thing, and this is it. I have a face that does nothing. I said, "Mrs. Tunney, where are you going tonight?" She said, "The Starlight, out on 62. Her sister was in Marysville, but her sister had a husband on oxygen and no room. I gave her every bill in my wallet, which was $220, and she tried to give it back, and I said, "You can take it, or you can watch a 73-year-old man put it under your windshield wiper in the rain." She took it. Then I asked her for one more thing. I asked her if, when they signed, anybody had made a recording of them. And Cleo Tunney's face changed. She said, "Oh, the video. Yes, he filmed us. He said it was for our protection." I asked if she had a copy. She said it was on a disc in the folder with the gold seal, and she had put the folder in the trunk under the winter coats because it was the only thing she had left that looked official. She gave me the disc. She wrote her phone number on the back of a grocery receipt in a shaking hand, and she said something as I was getting in my car that I have not been able to put down since. She said, "Mr. Redmond, the worst part is not the house. The worst part is that for 4 years I thought he was our friend. That night, I put the disc in the old laptop in the den and watched it with the volume at 2, with my wife asleep upstairs. It runs 11 minutes and 40 seconds. It is shot on a phone propped on something, so the frame is slightly crooked. Cleo and Wardell Tunney are sitting side by side at their kitchen table, in good clothes, the way people of our generation dress for a bank. Wardell has his hands folded on the table in front of him. There is a sheet of paper on the table between them. An off-camera voice tells them to state their names and the date. Then, Cleo Tunney reads from the sheet. She reads, "I am entering into this transaction voluntarily. I have had the opportunity to consult independent counsel of my own choosing. I am acting of my own volition, and I am under no duress from any party herein before named." She says it exactly that way. Herein before. 3 words, with a little stumble in the middle of it, the way anyone reads a word they have never said out loud. Then Wardell reads the same 3 sentences, in the same order, and gets caught on the same word, and says herein before, and then coughs, and the off-camera voice says, from the top, Wardell. From I am acting. And Wardell Tunney, 80 years old, 6 months out from a stroke, starts that sentence over. I sat in my den at 11 at night, and I felt the hair come up on my arms, and I could not have told you why. It was a small thing. It was a wrong-sounding thing in a room, the way a bailiff's shoe squeaks and you look up. I wrote in the pad, Tunney disc, both read from a page. Same words, same stumble, retake ordered. Then I underlined the word same, and I put the pad in the drawer, and I went upstairs, and I did not understand for another 18 days what I had just written down, because instead of following that thread, I followed the loud one. Saturday, the 19th of September. Kip Danner held an open house at 27 Vassar Court from noon to 2. I knew because it was on a sign on Delahunt, and because Vassar Court was on my list. It was one of the empty ones. Otis Kirkendall's neighbor Prudy Vane had lived at 27 Vassar and had gone into the Methodist home in February. I want to be honest about my state of mind that Saturday. I had a wife who was lying to me, a daughter who was lying to me, a heart operation coming in a month, a pill organizer with holes in it, and a piece of gravel from that driveway that I had kept, that I still have, in a film canister on my desk. I had been careful and quiet for 11 days, and it had gotten me nothing but a longer list. And I have a temper. It is slow, and it is rare, and it is the worst thing in me. My mother had it. I walked into that open house at 12:40 on a Saturday afternoon, with 8 other people in it, and I did not lower my voice. I asked Kip Danner, in the front room of a dead woman's house, in front of a young couple, with a baby carrier, and a man from the paper, and 2 neighbors, how many houses he had sold to Meridian Anchor. He said, "Sir, this isn't the place." I said, "Is 9 the number, or is 9 only the ones with a stamp on them?" He said, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." I said, "Otis Kirkendall taught shop at the high school for 30 years, and there is a lockbox on his door, and nobody on that street knows where he is. Do you?" The young couple left. The man from the paper did not leave, and I did not know at the time that his name was Ellery Knott, and that he wrote 3 paragraphs a week about zoning, and that he would matter later. And Kip Danner did a thing I did not expect. He walked over to me, and he stood close, and he said, very quietly, so nobody else could hear it, "I don't know, I've asked twice, please stop." Then he said, louder, "For the room, sir, please leave." So I left, and I sat in my car with my hands shaking on the wheel, and I told myself I had done something. What I had done was pick up a telephone for my son-in-law. Kip Danner called Fairhaven Legacy Partners at 1:52 that afternoon. I know the time because it is in a phone record that a sheriff's investigator read into a file 4 months later, and I have that file. At 4:20, the gray Tahoe pulled into my driveway. Trace came in through the front without knocking, which he had never done, and Nell came out of the kitchen drying her hands, and he did not even look at her. He looked at me and he said, "Chief, can I have 5 minutes?" We went into the den. He shut the door. Nell stayed on the other side of it. I could see her shadow under it the whole time, and I have thought since that she stood there not to listen, but because she could not make her legs take her away. He sat down in my chair. He put one ankle on the other knee, and he dropped the friendly voice like a man taking off a coat. He said, "You went to Vassar Court." I said, "It's a public open house." He said, "You went to the courthouse. You went to the bank. You went to see Cleo Tunney." He said the last name slowly, like a card laid on a table. I said nothing, which is a habit. He said, "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to stop." And then he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and he said, "Chief, I like you. I've always liked you. But I have watched you for 6 years, and I know exactly what you are. You are a man who wrote down what other people decided. 41 years, and not one thing in that building was yours. You typed. That's the whole resume." I said, "Is there a part of this where you say something I can use?" He smiled at that. He actually seemed to enjoy it. He said, "No." Then he stood up and put his hand on the doorknob and said the sentence that turned the whole thing. He said, "And Chief, before you make another phone call, you might want to ask your wife how she's been feeling, memory-wise, because I've got a folder, and the last thing you want is for a judge to read it before you do." He opened the door. Nell was standing right there. He said, "Hey, Nell, looking good," and walked out. My wife's face had gone the color of paper. She put her hand on the door frame. Then she went past me, and up the stairs, and into the bathroom, and shut the door, and I heard the tap run for 11 minutes, which is what she does when she does not want to be heard. I stood at the bottom of my own staircase and understood two things at once. The first was that everything I had done for 11 days had been done in the open, and he had been able to see all of it, because I had never once considered that anyone would think me worth watching. The second was that whatever the folder was, it was not about the house, it was about her. I gave her until Sunday. Sunday afternoon I sat down beside her on the piano bench, which is the one place in that house where we have always been able to say hard things, because you are side by side and nobody has to look at anybody. I said, "Nell, I know about the ring." She put her hands in her lap. I said, "I know about the pills. I know he comes on Tuesdays. I know about Cleo Tunney. I know there are 9 houses, and I know there is a folder." She was quiet for a long time. The furnace came on and went off. Then she said, "If I tell you, you will do something." I said, "Yes." She said, "And if you do something, I lose her." I said, "Lose who?" And my wife turned and looked at me, and I watched her decide, and I watched her lose the argument with herself, and she said, "Silas, I need you to trust me for 6 more weeks, after the 21st, after the operation. Then I'll tell you every word of it, and you can do whatever you want, and I won't stop you." I said, 6 weeks is a long time to be afraid." She said, "I've been afraid for 14 months. 6 more is nothing. 14 months. From the food liner. From the bench by the propane cage." I said, "All right. That was a lie, and she knew it was a lie, and she let me tell it, and I think she was grateful. That is what 48 years buys you at the end. Not honesty. Something more useful. That night I called our son. Bram answered from a job site with a compressor running behind him and told it to shut up, and then it was quiet and he said, "Dad?" and I could hear him already scared, because I do not call on Sunday nights. I told him most of it. Not the folder, not the pills. He said, "I can be there Wednesday." I said, "No." I said, "If you come now, he'll know I've called in the family, and he'll move faster." I said, "Stay where you are. Keep calling your mother at 4 o'clock like you always do, and be ready to come the hour I ask." He said, "Dad, that's not," and then he stopped, because he is my son, and he said, "Okay." And then he said, "Is she going to be all right for the surgery?" I said yes, because that is what you say. Monday the 21st, I went back to the courthouse. Ruth Ann Spratt was not on the desk. There was a young man on the desk with a lanyard and a policy about how many records he could pull. And I left after 15 minutes, rather than say something to a 24-year-old that I would have to apologize for. I came back Tuesday morning. Ruth Ann was there. I put a coffee on the counter for her, the way we used to, and she looked at it and said, "All right, Silas, what?" I said, "Ruth Ann, if I wanted to be sure that a deed on a property never turned up when somebody searched the address, how would I do it?" She set down what she was holding. She said, "That's an ugly question." I said, "I know it is." She said, "And you already know the answer, because I taught it to you in 1988. Here is the thing about a county recorder's office, and I am going to say it slowly, because it is the hinge of this entire story, and most people have never had a reason to learn it. There is not one index, there are 2. There is the tract index, which is organized by the land itself, by parcel number and legal description. That is what a person searches when they want to know what has happened to a house. Type in the address, and the office maps it to a parcel, and out comes the chain. And there is the grantor and grantee index, which is organized by human beings, alphabetical, by the name of the person who gave something away, and the name of the person who received it. That index does not care about the house at all. It cares about who signed. The two are supposed to agree. Ruth Ann said, if somebody wanted a document to be legally recorded, so that it is good against the world and it holds up in a refinance, but wanted it to be hard to find from the address side, they would submit it with the parcel number wrong. 1 digit, a transposition. The clerk keys what's on the form. It gets stamped. It gets a book and page. It is a perfectly valid recorded instrument. But the tract index files it under a parcel that doesn't match the address you're typing. I said, and how long would it take somebody to notice? She said, honestly, if nobody in the family is looking and the taxes are being paid, forever. We catch them on a title search when the property changes hands again, and then a nice person calls up and we correct it. I said, Ruth Ann, run me a name in the grantor index. She said, whose? I said, Redmond, Nellie. And Ruth Ann Spratt, who has known my wife for 30 years, looked at me across that counter for about 4 seconds, and then turned to her keyboard without a word, because she is a records clerk to the marrow. And to a records clerk the answer is the answer. She typed it. She hit return. The screen filled. I have watched juries hear verdicts. I have watched a man be told what his sentence was. I know what happens in a room when a fact arrives, and I have written down the sound of it hundreds of times. Pause. Then a sound the reporter marks as inaudible, because there is no spelling for it. There were 4 entries under my wife's name. The oldest was 1979, our purchase, both our names, Silas J. Redmond and Nell E. Redmond, husband and wife. The second was 2009, the mortgage satisfaction. The third was dated the 30th of October of the previous year. The fourth was dated the 6th of March of this year. Ruth Ann clicked the third one, and the image came up on the screen, a scan of a general warranty deed, and she turned the monitor toward me, and I put my hand on the counter because I needed something under it. The grantor was Nell E. Redmond. The grantee was Meridian Anchor, LLC. The property was 1114 Bellamy Street, New Perth, Ohio, described by metes and bounds that I could have recited in my sleep, and the parcel number under it read 41-08-1140072, where every tax bill in my desk for 46 years has read 41-08-1141-0072. Stated consideration, $214,000. And at the bottom, on the signature line, in my wife's small, careful hand, the hand that had written out 1,000 lesson receipts and every Christmas card I have ever sent, was her name. Only her name. Mine was nowhere on it. Ruth Ann printed it for me. She printed the fourth one too, and she charged me $2 because there is a fee, and she does not waive fees, and I have never loved anyone more for a small thing. I went and sat on the bench in the marble hall, the same bench where I ate a sandwich 3,000 times, and I read the fourth instrument. It was an affidavit of facts relating to title, filed the 6th of March, sworn by Nell E. Redmond. It said, in the flat way, those things say everything, that the affiant is the sole owner of record of the subject premises, that the affiant's spouse holds no interest, legal or equitable, in the subject premises, and that no dower, homestead, or marital claim exists which would encumber title. It was sworn under penalty of perjury. It was signed, my wife's hand again, smaller than in October, the letters not quite closing. Now I need to explain why that affidavit is the most important piece of paper in this entire story. More important than the deed, and I need to explain it in plain English, because when I finally understood it, at about 11:15 in the morning, on a bench outside the Aubrey County Recorder's office. Everything else fell into place like a bolt going home. Nell could not sell that house. We bought it in 1979 with both our names on the deed, as husband and wife, and in Ohio, that carries a marital interest that does not go away because one spouse signs something. Her deed to Meridian Anchor conveyed her half and left mine sitting right where it had been since I was 26 years old. It was not a sale. It was a crack in a wall. And a crack in a wall is fine, right up until the day somebody wants to borrow money against the wall. Because no lender in this country lends against a title with a hole in it. A title insurance underwriter would look at that chain for 90 seconds and say, "Where is the husband?" And somebody, in March, had tried to paper over that question with an affidavit swearing the husband did not exist as a matter of law. An affidavit is not a deed. An affidavit is a person promising. Underwriters take them all the time on small things, and I would bet the house I no longer owned that somebody at that underwriting desk had taken it in March, and then, closer to a real closing, had gone back and looked again and said no, which meant that as of the 8th of September, somebody needed my signature. Not my agreement, not my blessing, my signature, on a deed, at a closing table, on or before the 17th of October. And that is why a young real estate agent was sitting at my kitchen table at 10 minutes past 8 in the morning with a listing agreement that already had the buyer typed in and the closing date typed in. It was never a listing, it was a costume. The whole point of it was to walk me, in 15 easy days, to a chair with a pen in it. I sat on that bench and I laughed. One short, ugly sound. A woman with a stroller looked at me. They had spent 11 months building a machine, and the last part they needed was a signature from a man who spent 41 years watching people sign things. I drove out to Canton that afternoon. The notarial certificate on both instruments carried the same name and the same commission number, Delia Trombley. I looked her up. The commission was still good. The address on file was an apartment complex off Route 62. She was not there. But a young woman on the landing above told me Delia worked days at the Dairy Cone by the tire place. And did I want her to call? Delia Trombley is 26 years old. She has a nose ring and a tattoo of a hummingbird on her forearm, and she came out to the picnic table behind that ice cream stand in her apron, on her break, and I told her who I was and whose husband I was and what I had in my hand, and she sat down across from me and said, "Oh God," and put both hands over her mouth. She had been a receptionist at Fairhaven Legacy Partners for 19 months. She said Mr. Cobb had paid for her notary commission as a bonus. She said she had thought that was generous. She said she quit in April. And when I asked her why, she said, "Because of the mornings." I asked what she meant by the mornings. She said, "He'd text me at like 5:30, meet me at such and such, and it was never an office. It was a hospital lot, or a parking garage, or one time a rehab place in Zanesville, and the person was always old and always by themselves." I asked her if she kept a journal, and Delia Trombley said the thing that made the rest of this possible. She said, "I kept two." She had kept the official one, the bound book with the numbered lines, and turned it over to the office when she left, which she now understood had been a mistake. And she had kept a second one, a spiral notebook, because her instructor at the community college class had told her class that a notary's journal is her own personal protection and belongs to her and nobody else, and that she should never let anyone else hold the only copy. And Delia Trombley had been nervous enough about the mornings to take that advice literally. She still had it. In a shoebox. In her mother's basement in Canton. She drove me there in a Kia, with a cracked windshield, and we went down into a basement that smelled like every basement, and she came up with a red spiral notebook, and we sat on the steps, and she found it for me. Entry 118, 30th of October. Time, 6:40 a.m. Location, St. Casimir's Regional Medical Center. Parking structure, Level 2. Document, General Warranty Deed. Signer, Nell E. Redmond. Identification, Ohio driver's license. Expiration noted. Last 4 digits noted. Signature of signer. And in the column Delia had ruled herself and labeled other persons present, in blue ballpoint, T. Cobb. And then, below the line, in the margin, in the same blue ink, 3 words that a 26-year-old girl had written to herself in a cold parking garage because something about it had bothered her enough to need saying. She was crying. I want you to hold that image with me for a second, because I could not get past it for about a week. 6:40 in the morning, the 30th of October. That is a date I did not need to look up, because it is on a card, on our refrigerator, with a magnet shaped like a slice of watermelon on it. The 30th of October, 1 year ago, was the morning of Nell's cardiac catheterization. I drove her there myself. We left the house at 6:15. I dropped her at the front doors because it was cold, and she said, "Don't be silly. Park. I'll wait inside where it's warm." So I parked. And while I was walking in from the far lot, my wife was on level 2 of that garage in the dark, with a 26-year-old notary and my son-in-law, signing away our house and crying, and then she went upstairs and put on a gown and let them put a catheter into her heart, and at 11 o'clock I brought her a ginger ale, and she smiled at me from the bed and said the ceiling tiles had 140 holes in each one she'd counted. 48 years, and I never asked her why she was pale. I got home at 6:10. She had made pork chops. I did not say anything. I took the 3 documents out of the envelope and laid them on the kitchen table, side by side, the deed, the affidavit, and the photograph I had taken of page 118 of a red spiral notebook. I laid them out square, the way you hand an exhibit to a judge, and then I sat down and folded my hands. Nell stood at the stove with a fork in her hand and looked at the table. She did not pretend. I will love her forever for not pretending. She put the fork down. She turned the burner off. She sat down across from me, and she said, "All right." It took her 2 hours, and I am going to give it to you the way she gave it to me, because it is hers. It started 3 days after the food liner. Trace came to the house on a Tuesday afternoon with a folder. Not the sales folder with the gold seal. A different one. He sat in my chair in the den, and he was kind, she said. He was very kind. He said he was worried. He said Dinah was worried, and did not know how to bring it up. In the folder was a letter on medical letterhead from a physician's assistant at a walk-in clinic in Canton. A man Nell had seen exactly once for a sinus infection in 2019, expressing concern regarding an episode of acute disorientation and recommending evaluation for capacity. Behind that was a form, a real form, the one the probate court in this county uses, filled out on a computer and printed clean. Application for appointment of guardian of an alleged incompetent. In the blank for the alleged incompetent, Nell E. Redmond. In the blank for the applicant, Dinah R. Cobb. It was not signed. It was not filed. It was, in every way that matters legally, nothing at all. It was also the most effective weapon anyone has ever used on my wife. Trace told her what a guardianship means. He told her most of it accurately, which is the part that makes me sick. He told her that if the court appointed a guardian, she would no longer decide where she lived, or what medical treatment she received, or what she signed, or who came to see her. He told her that the court would want to know why a woman of 70 needed protection, and that people would testify, and that the transcript of that hearing would be public in the building where her husband worked for 41 years. And then he said the sentence that bought him 11 months. He said, "Nell, Dinah doesn't want to sign this. She cries about it. But she's a mother, and Junie is with you 3 afternoons a week, and if there's an incident, that's on us." That was all. He never threatened to take Junie. He never said a word you could put in a complaint. He simply arranged the furniture so that the only door out of the room was the one he was standing in. Nell asked him what she should do, and Trace Cobb said, "Well, one thing that helps enormously is showing the court that a person is managing her affairs responsibly, downsizing, planning, putting the equity where it does some good, instead of sitting in a house that's too big for 2 people. He came back the next Tuesday, and the next. He explained the program the same way he had explained it to the Tunnies at a church supper. Sell the house to the partner fund, take a lifetime right to remain, release the equity. And because Silas is proud, Nell, because your husband is a proud man, and he will fight this, and a fight is exactly what puts you in front of a judge. We do the paperwork on your side first, quietly, and we bring him in at the end, when it's all done and safe." She said, "My name is on it too," and he said, "That's fine, we'll handle that." She signed on the 30th of October at 6:40 in the morning on level 2 of a parking garage, because that was the only time and place she could go without me, and because she had a catheter appointment at 7:15, and because she had spent 4 days believing that if she did not sign, her granddaughter would be taken out of her arms, and her own mind would be taken away from her, in a public hearing in her husband's courthouse. She got nothing. There was no check. She was told the $214,000 went into a reserve account at the fund, from which the fees would be drawn and from which her lifetime tenancy would be credited, and that a statement would come quarterly. 3 statements came. They were 1 page. They were, I would later learn, made in a word processor. In January, the fund began billing her rent, $630. In April, it was $905. In July, it was $1,180. She paid it out of the account her mother left her. And when that ran dry in August, she pawned her mother's ring. And when the ring money ran out, she started cutting her medication in half, because a diuretic is $9 and a rhythm medication is $140, and she had decided, alone, at our kitchen table, which of the 2 she could most afford to be without. My wife stopped there and could not go on for a while. I said, "Nell, why not tell me? Any morning of 11 months, why not tell me?" And she said, "Because you would have gone to the courthouse and made a record and taken it to somebody, and he would have filed that form the same day, and I would have spent this year in a hearing instead of on a piano bench with Junie." Then she said, "And because I was ashamed." I asked her about the 8th of September. She said that the pressure had changed in August, that Trace had come every week and stopped being kind, that he had said the fund was refinancing in October, and that the paperwork had to be clean by the 17th, and that if it was not clean, the fund would take the position that she had misrepresented her ownership, and that misrepresentation on a recorded affidavit is a felony, and would she like Junie to visit her grandmother somewhere with a visiting room. So she called Kip Danner's office and told him she wanted to list the house. And on the morning of the 8th, At 8:40, while I was sitting upstairs on the edge of our bed watching rain, our daughter called her mother from the parking lot of Cardinal Title and Escrow. Dinah had been given a file that morning to prepare for a closing on the 17th. Redmond, 1114 Bellamy. And in the file was a deed already conveying from Meridian Anchor to a second entity, and a payoff statement, and a title requirement in bold type that read, "Obtain deed from Silas J. Redmond, spouse of record." And my daughter, who had spent 11 months telling herself that her husband was helping her parents, sat in her car and read a requirement that said her father did not know. The call lasted 4 minutes and 9 seconds. Nell told me every word of it, and I wrote them down that night, and this is the one that matters. Dinah said, "Mom, whatever you do, don't let Dad sign anything." And then Nell went into the den and turned on my computer and found the county's website, which she had never used in her life, and typed her own name into the grantor index, the way she had watched me type things into machines for 50 years, and printed the deed, and stood in the kitchen holding it. And I came down the stairs and took my keys off the hook and went out to move the car. So she ran out into the rain in her bare feet, with the proof in her fist, and she went down on the driveway, and she begged me not to sell the house I no longer owned, and she would not open her hand, because her name was on it, and mine was not, and she could not stand for me to see that. We sat in that kitchen until midnight. At some point she got up and put the pork chops in the refrigerator, because she is who she is. And when she finally went up, I stayed at the table with 3 pieces of paper, and I did the thing I know how to do. I made an index. Not a plan. An index. What do I have? Where is it? Who else has a copy? And what is missing? What I had. A recorded deed with one signature on it. A sworn affidavit that was false. A notary's private journal, placing my son-in-law in a parking garage at 6:40 in the morning with a crying woman. 60 days of video of a gray Tahoe. A pawn ticket. A pill organizer. 9 addresses. 1 disc from 1 couple. And 12 years of steno pads, now including 40 pages of the last 15 days, written in a shorthand that maybe 4 people in this county can read. What was missing was the only thing that mattered. Everything I had proved, that Trace Cobb had taken houses from old people. It did not prove that anyone had been forced. And that is the whole game, because the program was designed from the first day so that every victim would sign, in ink, in front of a notary, a statement that they had not been forced. The next morning, Wednesday the 23rd, I drove to the Aubrey County Sheriff's Office and asked for whoever handled fraud. That is one person. Her name is Detective Ola Renner. She is maybe 40. She has a desk in a room with 3 other desks, and she was eating oatmeal out of a mug when I came in, and she listened to me for 50 minutes without once looking at her phone, which I have decided is the highest compliment one adult can pay another in this century. At the end, she said, "Mr. Redmond, this is a good case." I said, "Thank you." She said, "And I need you to understand what a good case means at this desk." Then she was honest with me, and I have never held it against her. She said the deed was recorded and facially valid. She said the affidavit was the crime, and it was a good one, but the person who swore, it was my wife, and the first thing a defense attorney would do is point at the 71-year-old woman whose signature was on it. She said the lender was in another state, which meant a subpoena, which meant 30 days if she was lucky. She said the entity was a Delaware limited liability company with a registered agent and a Canton post office box, and that peeling it would take a forensic accountant she did not have. She said her supervisor would want a victim willing to testify, and my wife was not, yet, and could not be made to be. She said 60 days, 90, realistically, and that is if nothing goes sideways. I said, the closing is on the 17th of October. She said, I know. I'm sorry. I can't stop a closing. Then Detective Renner leaned back and did something I did not expect. She said, off the record, Mr. Redmond, do you want the honest advice? I said, please. She said, the way these things break is never the paper. It's a person. Find the one who is tired of it and get them talking, and bring me that, and I will move mountains in a week. I drove out to the Starlight Motel on Route 62 that afternoon. It is 14 units in an L, with an ice machine that has not worked since the Clinton administration, and the Tunnies were in number 9, with the Buick backed up to the door. Wardell was in a chair by the window with a blanket over his knees. Cleo had put a tablecloth on the little table. That is what got me. In a motel room on Route 62, my neighbor had put a tablecloth on the table. I told them the whole thing, all of it, including my wife, and Cleo Tunney listened, and then she said, how many of us are there? I said 9 that I know of, in this county. She said, give me the addresses. Here is what a 76-year-old woman, with a husband on a walker, and $1,100 to her name, did over the following 7 days. She called every one of them. Some she knew, some she did not. She got the numbers from a church directory, from the Methodist home, from a woman at the library who runs the local history table. She got hung up on twice. She drove to the Methodist home and sat with Prudy Vane in a common room and got a nephew's phone number in Toledo. She found Otis Kirkendall, the shop teacher, in a memory care facility in Marysville, and she found out that his signature was on a deed dated 4 months after his daughter had been told he could no longer manage a checkbook. And she asked every single one of them the same question I had asked her. Did he film you? 6 of them still had the disc. 2 more had a copy on a family member's computer, sent as an attachment years ago and never opened again. Otis Kirkendall's daughter in Delaware had hers in a drawer. The 2 Licking County families overnighted theirs in a padded envelope with a note in it that said, use them. By the 2nd of October I had 11 of them, and Cleo Tunney had a list in her own handwriting of 11 households in 3 counties, because 2 of the families had cousins in Licking County who had been through the same church supper and the same folder. 11. I set up the old laptop on the desk in the den. I put my steno machine on the stand beside it. The stenograph I have owned since 1994 and have never been able to make myself sell. And on the night of the 2nd of October, at 73 years old, I did the only thing I have ever been good at. I transcribed them, all 11. Verbatim, every word, every false start, every cough, every off-camera prompt, with timestamps at 10-second intervals the way I was trained, on a machine, with my hands, the way I did it for 4,000 hearings, in a building where nobody ever once asked me what I thought. It took me 19 hours across 3 days. And somewhere in the second one, I stopped feeling like a man who had lost his house. Junie turned 9 on the 4th of October, and there was a party. I want to be clear that I did not decide to go to that party in order to do what I did. I had already decided to go, because she is 9, and she asked me to, and because Nell was not going to miss it. What I decided, standing in my kitchen on Sunday morning, holding a wrapped box with a set of watercolors in it, was that if I found myself alone in that house for 4 minutes, I would use them. There were maybe 25 people in the backyard on Wistman Road. A rented inflatable slide, a grill. Trace in an apron, shaking hands, remembering names. He came over and said, "Chief," and put out his hand, and I shook it, because Junie was watching. At about 3:15, a piñata went up. Trace's office is off the front hall, on the other side of the house from the yard, and it has a window that looks out at nothing but the neighbor's fence. The door was not locked. There is no reason to lock a door in your own house on your daughter's birthday. He is not sloppy, but he is arrogant, and arrogance in a filing cabinet looks like organization. Everything was labeled: bottom drawer, hanging folders, alphabetical by street. Coburn 418. That was the Tunnies. Delahunt 219. Vassar 27. 6th 611. Bellamy 1114. And at the back of the drawer, in a wider folder with a red tab, one that was not a street: Pallister, Aubrey Pool NC. I took 20 photographs in 4 minutes and 11 seconds with the telephone my son gave me for my birthday. I photographed the first and last page of 5 street files. I photographed a page in the Bellamy file that was a checklist with items ticked in pen, and the last unticked item read, in a hand I recognized from Christmas cards, SJR Execution, 1017. And then I photographed all 9 pages of the red tab folder, and I did not read a word of them, because there was a piñata, and there is a limit to how long a man can be in a bathroom. I came out. I ate a piece of cake. Junie showed me the watercolors and told me she was going to paint the dog, and the dog would hate it. Nell sat in a lawn chair in the shade, with her hand flat on her chest, in a way I had started watching for. We went home at 6. I sat down in the den at 7, and I put the photographs up on the laptop screen, and I read the red tab folder, and my hands went cold, and I want to tell you what was in it, because it is the reason this stopped being about a house. It was a term sheet and a schedule from Pallister Capital Partners, an outfit in Charlotte. It described a refinancing of a portfolio, identified as Aubrey Pool 2, 12 residential properties in 3 Ohio counties, cross-collateralized, to be funded on the 15th of October. Principal, $4,100,000. Behind it was a 2-page schedule, 1 line per property, with columns: address, acquisition date, appraised value, occupancy status, and the last column was headed, in 6-point type, delivery premium. There was a footnote. Footnote 3. I have read it several hundred times, and I could recite it into a machine at 230 words a minute right now. It said that for each scheduled property, delivered to the borrower, in a vacant and unencumbered condition, on or before the funding date, the borrower shall receive a credit against the origination fee in the amount of $18,000 per unit, such credit reflecting the reduced holding risk and accelerated disposition timeline of unoccupied assets. $18,000 per unit. Vacant. Read it in plain English. Every old person still living in one of those 12 houses on the 15th of October was costing my son-in-law $18,000. And in the occupancy column, next to 418 Coburn, somebody had already typed the word vacant in capital letters, on a line where 2 people had lived for 44 years, one of whom was at that moment sitting in a chair by a window at the Starlight Motel with a blanket over his knees. That is when I stopped thinking about my house. That is when I understood that the 12 names on that schedule were not a list of properties. They were a list of people who were worth more gone. I did not sleep. I sat in the den and built the file. Every document numbered, every photograph printed at the drugstore on 6th because I do not trust a screen. 11 transcripts bound with the tape numbers on the cover sheet, an index at the front in my own printing. On Monday I called Detective Renner and left a message that I had something, and could I come Tuesday morning. And on Tuesday morning, the 6th of October, at 7:20, my telephone rang, and it was my daughter, and she was crying so hard I could not understand her for the first 15 seconds. What she was saying was, "Dad, he can see the pictures." 2 Christmases ago, Dinah set up a shared photograph album for the family. She did it because Bram was in Arizona, and Junie was small, and my mother-in-law was still alive, and nobody was seeing anybody's pictures. She set it up on her phone, on Nell's, on mine, on Bram's, and on her husband's. It is called Redmond Cobb Family. There are 1,100 photographs in it, mostly of a child and a dog, and it is set, as it has been for 2 years, to add my photographs automatically. Everything I take goes into it. Every picture of a gutter I needed to remember. Every page of a manual. Every one of the 20 photographs I took in a lockless office on the 4th of October at 3:15 in the afternoon, uploaded from my pocket over that house's own wireless network before I had finished eating the cake. Trace Cobb had woken up on Tuesday morning, scrolled his telephone, and found 9 photographs of a Pallister Capital term sheet, sitting between a picture of his daughter on an inflatable slide and a picture of a piñata. I am 73 years old. I spent my life around evidence, and I have a fireproof box in my basement, and a habit of writing in a code that 4 people can read. And I was undone in 40 hours by a convenience feature I did not know was on. I want to say this to every man my age watching this, and I want to say it without a joke in it, because it is the single most expensive thing I have ever learned. The world is now built to copy everything you do to everyone you know, automatically, by default, for your convenience. Nobody asks you, nobody tells you, "Go and look at what your telephone is sharing tonight." Go and look, because I did not, and it cost my wife 2 weeks and a man his life. What followed was 9 days, and I am going to give them to you in order, because the order is the thing. Tuesday the 6th, 10:40 in the morning. A woman from Cardinal Title called our house and told Nell in a bright voice that the closing had been moved up, not the 17th, the 13th at 9 a.m., and would Mr. and Mrs. Redmond both please bring photo identification. Tuesday, 2 in the afternoon. Dinah was put on administrative leave from Cardinal Title, pending review of a file handling matter. Nobody said which file. Her manager would not look at her. Wednesday the 7th. Trace took Junie out of school at 11:15 and drove her to his mother's house outside Elizabethtown, Kentucky, and told Dinah by text message that Junie needed some stability while things were being worked out, and that she was welcome to come down any time, and that if she involved anybody, that would be a decision she was making about her own daughter. My granddaughter missed 8 days of the 3rd grade. Wednesday afternoon, a courier brought me a letter from a law office in Canton. It informed me that my recent statements to third parties concerning Fairhaven Legacy Partners were defamatory per se, that my contact with clients of the firm constituted tortious interference, and that I was to cease immediately. It demanded I return all confidential materials in my possession. It was 4 pages, and it used the word immediately 11 times. The same letter, with the name changed, went to 9 households. 3 of them called me that night and asked to be left out of it. Prudy Vane's nephew in Toledo told me his aunt was 84 and could not be in a lawsuit, and I said I understood, and I did, and I copied her disc and drove the original back to the Methodist home myself the next morning, because a scared person deserves to be handed the thing back in person. Thursday the 8th, 8:50 in the morning. St. Casimir's Regional called about the 21st. Nell took it. I watched her take it. She said yes, and then she said, "I don't understand," and then she said it again, and then she wrote something on the back of an envelope and said thank you, and hung up, and stood there holding the envelope. The mitral valve repair scheduled for the 21st of October was cancelled. Pre-authorization had lapsed. The supplemental policy that covered the difference, a policy Trace Cobb had set up for us 4 years ago as a favor, at a family dinner, on his laptop, over Pi, had gone unpaid since August, and had terminated for non-payment on the 1st of October. The scheduler was very kind. She said they had a cancellation list. She said the next block for that procedure, with that surgeon, was the 9th of February. I called Dr. Barzagar's office and made a nuisance of myself and got her at 4 in the afternoon, and I asked her one question, which is a question I do not recommend asking. I asked her what February meant. And Ines Barzagar, who is a careful woman and does not deal in drama, was quiet for 3 seconds, and then said, "Mr. Redmond, her ejection fraction in June was 38. I moved her up once already. February is not a plan I would have chosen." I said, "Is she going to make February?" She said, "I don't know." And then she said, "Get it fixed sooner." Friday the 9th. Cleo Tunney called me at 6 in the morning. Wardell had died in the night, in the chair by the window at Unit 9 of the Starlight Motel on Route 62, where he had been living for 24 days because the rent on the house he had paid off in 1994 had gone from $510 to $1,400. He was 80. He drove a school bus in this county for 26 years. There are men and women in New Perth in their 50s who learned to sit down and face front from Wardell Tunney. The death certificate says cardiac arrest, and it is not wrong. I drove out there and sat with Cleo until her sister came from Marysville. The tablecloth was still on the table. At some point she said, "They'll want the room by 11, and I said, "No, they will not," and I went to the office to pay for 3 more nights, and the girl behind the glass would not take my money, and I have not forgotten her either. On the way home, I pulled into the gravel lot behind the Lutheran church, the same lot I had watched my own house from, and I sat there, and I broke. I am going to say this plainly, because I think men my age need to hear another man say it. I sat in a parked car in a church lot at 9:30 in the morning, and cried until I could not see, with both hands on the wheel, for something like 20 minutes. For Wardell Tunney, whom I barely knew. For my wife's mother's ring. For 11 months of Tuesday afternoons when I was 2 towns away, writing down other men's lives. And when it was over, I did something I had not done in the whole 32 days. I got out the schedule, Saturday the 10th, in the occupancy column of the Pallister schedule. 418 Coburn said vacant. There was a delivery premium of $18,000 against it. Wardell Tunney had died in a motel room on the 9th, and on the 15th of October, a company in Charlotte was going to pay $18,000 for that fact. Sunday the 11th. Nell could not get up the stairs. She got to the 4th step and sat down on it, and could not get her breath, and her lips had a color I had never seen on her, and she waved me off with one hand and said, "Give me a minute," and I did not give her a minute. I put her in the car. St. Casimir's kept her overnight. Fluid on the lungs. They pulled 6 pounds off her with an IV drip, and a resident about Junie's height told me, in a hallway at 1 in the morning, that this was going to keep happening, and that the repair was the answer, and did we have a date? I said we had had one. Monday the 12th, 4 in the afternoon, They let her come home with a prescription and a warning. And at 6:30 that evening, my daughter Dinah came to our house and stood on the porch in the cold, with her arms wrapped around herself, and did not come in until I asked her twice. She had a canvas tote bag over her shoulder. She sat at the kitchen table where her mother had sat, and she did not take her coat off, and she said, "I need to tell you what I did." 11 months earlier, in November, a file had come across her desk, Meridian Anchor. She had recognized the buyer name because her husband had mentioned the fund at home, and she had done what an escrow officer is not supposed to do, which was mention it to him, and he had said, "Oh good, that one's your parents. They've been working on it with me for months. Your dad's being very quiet about it because he's embarrassed about the money." She said, and I believed him. She said, "Dad, I have closed 400 files a year for 11 years, and I have never once let a personal thing near a file." And he handed me a story that made my own father into a proud man with a secret, and I took it, because I have believed things about you my whole life that made that easy. That landed where it was aimed. I let it. Then she opened the tote bag. Inside were 12 manila file jackets, copied at a print shop on Quarry Road on the night she was walked out of the building, because she had known on the 6th that she was not going to be allowed back in. She said, "These are the closing files. All 12 properties, every settlement statement, every disbursement instruction, every wire." And then she put her hand flat on top of them and said the sentence I had been waiting 5 weeks for. She said, "None of them got paid. We worked until 3 in the morning at that table, my daughter and I, with a legal pad between us." Here is what the 12 files showed. Every settlement statement recited a purchase price. $214,000 for us, $186 for the Tunnies, $202 for Otis Kirkendall, 12 of them, adding to $2,311,000. And every one of them carried a disbursement instruction on the last page, signed by an authorized representative of the buyer, directing the settlement agent to wire the seller's net proceeds to an account at a bank in Canton. Dinah pulled the account number off the first one and laid it beside the second and the third. It was the same account on all 12. It was Meridian Anchor's own operating account. The memo line on every wire read, "Reserve, internal, per addendum," which means that on 12 separate occasions, at a closing table, a settlement agent moved money from the buyer's account to the buyer's account and printed a piece of paper telling an old person that they had been paid. 12 of them are in that file cabinet as receipts. Not $1 left the building. 2 of the 12 did get money. Cleo Tunney's $41,000 and one other, both in the first year, both wired out properly. Dinah said, "That's the seed. You pay the first 2, and then those 2 go to church and tell everybody it's real." I wrote that down verbatim. By 4 in the morning, we had it laid out in a chain that a person could follow, and it was strong, and it still had the hole in it. Every file contained the signed acknowledgement. Every file contained the disc. The next day, Tuesday the 13th, at 9 in the morning, there was a closing scheduled at Cardinal Title and Escrow, on Quarry Road, for the property at 1114 Bellamy Street, and Mr. and Mrs. Redmond were asked to bring photo identification. I did not go. Neither did my wife. At 9:40, my telephone rang, and it was Trace, and it was the first time in 6 years I had heard him without the coat on. He said, "Get down here." I said no. He said, "Chief, you don't understand what you're doing." I said, "I understand the arithmetic. 18,000 a unit, 12 units. $216,000 in credits, if you can hand them a schedule with the word vacant all the way down the column. Wardell Tunney's line already says it. There was a silence on that phone that went on for about 6 seconds, and I sat in my kitchen and listened to it, and it was the sweetest sound I ever heard, because it was the sound of a man realizing he did not know what I had. Then he said, very quietly, "Your wife swore an affidavit." I said, "Yes." He said, "Do you know what happens to her?" I said, "We're going to find out." And I hung up, which I do not think anyone had done to him in years. Then I went into the den and did the last piece of work. I had 11 transcripts. I printed them at 10-point on the drugstore printer, and I laid them out on the floor of my den in 2 rows, and I got down on my knees, which at 73 is a commitment, and I read them across instead of down. Line 1 of all 11. Then line 2 of all 11. I am entering into this transaction voluntarily. I have had the opportunity to consult independent counsel of my own choosing. I am acting of my own volition, and I am under no duress from any party herein before named. 11 people, 4 years, 3 counties, 2 women who had never met, a man in memory care in Marysville, and a widow in a common room on Vassar Court, identical, to the comma, to the last syllable, not similar, not consistent, the same. Nobody says herein before named. Nobody has ever said it. It is not a phrase that comes out of a human being who is describing their own state of mind. It is a phrase that comes off a card, and in 9 of the 11, the reader stumbles on it, and in 4 of the 11, a voice off camera says, "From the top." On Otis Kirkendall's disc, at minute 6, that 81-year-old man stops in the middle of the second sentence and asks, out loud, in his own kitchen, "Who is Meridian?" And the voice off camera says, "We went over that, Otis. From the top. From I am acting." And Otis Kirkendall says, "From I am acting." Now here is the part that I did not expect, and that I want to tell carefully, because it is the reason a man who typed for 41 years was able to do something nobody else in this county could have done. In the red tab folder, there was a 1-page diligence memo from Pallister Capital, dated in August, reviewing the borrower's file. Under a heading called Consumer Acknowledgement Verification, it said that a sample of the acknowledgement recordings had been reviewed, and that the reviewer had spot-checked the opening 20 seconds of each, and confirmed that all conformed to the required script. The opening 20 seconds. Every one of those recordings begins with a name and a date and a person sitting up straight in good clothes. The coaching is at minute 4. The retakes are at minute 6. Otis Kirkendall asks who Meridian is at minute 6 and 10. The lender never watched to the end. Nobody ever watches to the end. Except a court reporter. A court reporter transcribes the whole tape. Every time. Beginning to end, including the part where the microphone is bumped, and the part where somebody sneezes, and the part where a lawyer says something off the record that he thinks is not being taken down. And it is, because that is the job, and because for 41 years, my job was to be the one person in the room who did not decide what mattered. Trace Cobb told me in my own den that I was a man who wrote down what other people decided. He was right, and it turned out that was the only skill in Aubrey County that could take him apart. On Wednesday the 14th, I drove the whole thing to Detective Ola Renner in 2 banker's boxes, the 12 closing files, the wire instructions, the notary's private journal, 60 days of Emil Bogdan's video, signed and dated in an engineer's printing, the Pallister term sheet with footnote 3 circled, the 11 transcripts, and a sworn statement from Nell E. Redmond, notarized that morning by Lorna Pike at the Aubrey County Savings and Trust, describing a parking garage at 6:40 in the morning. Renner read for 2 hours. Then she came out and said, "Mr. Redmond, I can have a warrant. I need 8 to 10 days. I said, "The note funds tomorrow at noon." She said, "I know. I can't stop it." I said, "I know you can't. But there is a room tomorrow morning where the man who is signing the check will be sitting 11 feet from the man who is cashing it." And I said, "Detective, I do not need you to arrest anybody. I need you to be in that room, in a chair, with a notebook, so that everything said in front of you is said in front of a sworn officer." And Ola Renner looked at me for a long moment and said, "What time?" The Fairhaven Legacy Partners Client Appreciation Brunch was held in the Ardsley Room at the Hollingbrook Country Club on Thursday the 15th of October from 10 until noon. I know that because we were on the mailing list. We had been on it for 4 years. The card had a picture of a sunrise on it. Nell got dressed at 8. I stood in the bedroom doorway and said, "You don't have to come." She was putting on her mother's earrings, since her mother's ring was in a case on 5th Street. She said, "Silas, I have been in that room." I sat at one of those tables and let him introduce me as a satisfied client. I said, "Inez Barzagar would put me in the ground for taking you." And my wife looked at me in the mirror and said, "Then you'd better get a chair for me near the door." We came in 5 cars, Nell and me, Dinah, Cleo Tunney, and her sister from Marysville, Emil Bogdan, in a suit I had never seen, from 1981, with a laptop bag. Delia Trombley, who had asked for the morning off from the Dairy Cone and had a red spiral notebook in her purse. Otis Kirkendall's daughter, who had flown from Wilmington the night before. 2 of the Licking County families. Ellery Knott from the paper, who I had called on Tuesday and who had said, "Hold on," and gotten a pen. And Detective Ola Renner, in a gray blazer, who took a chair at the back by the coffee urns and put a notebook on her knee, and did not say a word to anyone the entire time. I carried a black case. Inside it was a stenograph machine I bought in 1994. There were about 40 people in the Ardsley Room, round tables with white cloths, a buffet with a chafing dish of scrambled eggs. Most of the guests were between 65 and 85, in their good clothes, on a Thursday morning, because somebody had told them they were valued. Trace saw us at 9:50. He was at the front by a projector screen with a lapel microphone already clipped on, and he saw my wife first, and then me, and then Cleo Tunney, and then Delia Trombley, and I watched him do the arithmetic in about a second and a half, and I want to tell you that his face did not change at all. That is what he is. He walked over to a table of 4 strangers and asked them how the drive-in was. At 10:10, he spoke for 18 minutes about legacy. At 10:28, he said, "Before we get to the good part, does anybody have a question?" I stood up. I am not a large man. I have never raised my voice in a room in my life. And I have sat in the well of a courtroom under a judge for 4 decades, and learned the one thing about volume, that nobody believes until they see it. In a quiet room, the softest voice is the one everybody leans toward. I said, "My name is Silas Redmond. My wife and I live at 1114 Bellamy Street." Trace said, "Chief, why don't we?" I said, "I have 3 sentences I would like to read, and then I have 1 question for the room, and then I read them. I am entering into this transaction voluntarily. I have had the opportunity to consult independent counsel of my own choosing. I am acting of my own volition, and I am under no duress from any party herein before named." I put the page down. I said, "My question is this. Has anybody in this room ever read those words out loud off a card, in your own kitchen, while somebody filmed you on a telephone?" Nobody moved. Then, at a table near the middle, a small woman in a lavender cardigan put her hand up. Her name is Bernice Otwell, and she is 82, and she lives on 6th Street. Then, a man at the back put his hand up. Then Cleo Tunney stood, which is a different thing than a hand. Then Otis Kirkendall's daughter said, "My father did, and he doesn't know what a meridian is." 6 hands. In a room of 40 people who had come for eggs, Trace said, "All right, that's enough," and reached for the microphone at his collar. And I kept talking in exactly the same voice. I said, "I am not going to tell you what any of it means. I am going to read you what is on the paper, and then you can all decide, because that is what I did for a living." I said, "There is a term sheet dated the 22nd of August, between Fairhaven's Fund and Pallister Capital Partners of Charlotte, North Carolina, covering 12 houses in 3 counties, funding today at noon for $4,100,000. I said, "Footnote 3 of that term sheet provides a credit of $18,000 per unit for each property delivered vacant." I said, "In plain words, this fund is paid $18,000 for every one of you who is no longer in your house by 12 o'clock today." The room made a sound, not a gasp. "A lower sound than that," I said. "On the schedule, the line for 418 Coburn Street says vacant. Wardell Tunney drove a school bus in this county for 26 years. He was moved out of that house on the 16th of September, and he died in a chair at the Starlight Motel on Route 62 on the 9th of this month. He is line 4. Cleo Tunney stood in the middle of that room and did not make a sound and did not sit down. Trace was moving toward me. He said, "This man's wife has been under psychiatric evaluation." And my wife stood up. Nell Redmond stood up out of a chair near the door with her hand on the back of it, and she said, "I have not." The room turned. She said, "My name is Nell Redmond. On the 30th of October last year, at 6:40 in the morning, I signed a deed to my house on level 2 of the parking garage at St. Casimir's, 40 minutes before a catheter went into my heart, because that man sat in my den with a guardianship form with my daughter's name typed on it, and let me look at it for as long as I needed to." She said, "I was crying." The notary wrote it down, and Delia Trombley stood up in the back of the room with a red spiral notebook in both hands and said, "I did. Entry 118. I've got it right here. That is when he lost it." I have thought a great deal about that moment, because for 6 years I had never seen the coat come off, and it turns out there was almost nothing underneath it. He shouted. He called me a bitter old typist. He called Cleo Tunney, a name I will not repeat in front of you about a dead man. He knocked over a chafing dish of scrambled eggs going around the end of the table, and 2 men his own age got up out of their seats to stand in his way, and one of them was a retired lineman named Curtis Vandenberg, who had come for the free brunch. And through all of it, I stayed standing. And I did not raise my voice one time, and I said the last thing I had. I said, "Mr. Rinkemelu." There was a man at the front table, in a good suit, who had been sitting very still for 4 minutes, with his telephone face down in front of him. Adair Rinkemelu had flown in from Charlotte the night before, to shake hands and watch the fund close. I said, "Sir, your August diligence memo says your reviewer spot-checked the first 20 seconds of each acknowledgement recording." He said, "That's not a document, I said, "I have 11 of those recordings, and I have transcribed all 11 to the end. Sir, in Disc 4, At minute 6 and 10 seconds, an 81-year-old man with dementia asks who Meridian is, and a voice off camera tells him to take it from the top. And I held up the disc, and I said, "Your projector is right there." The kid running the AV cart was about 22 years old, and he looked at Nkemelu, and Nkemelu looked at the disc for about 3 seconds, and then he said, out loud, "In that room, play it." Otis Kirkendall's voice came up on the speakers of the Ardsley Room at the Hollingbrook Country Club at 17 minutes to 11 in the morning. "Who's Meridian?" And Trace Cobb's voice, off camera, patient as a Sunday. "We went over that, Otis, from the top, from I Am Acting." 40 people listened to that in a room with a buffet in it. Adair Nkemelu picked up his telephone, stood, walked 8 feet to the window, and said 10 words that ended it. He said, "Don't fund Aubrey Poole. Nothing goes out. Stop it now." It was 10:49. The note was to fund at noon. Here is what happened after. In order. With the numbers. Because vague endings are how people get away with things. The wire never went out. Aubrey Poole II died at 10:49 in the morning, on the 15th of October, in a country club dining room, with scrambled eggs on the carpet. On the 26th of October, Detective Ola Renner and 2 deputies arrested Trace Cobb in the parking lot of the Fairhaven office on Route 62 in Canton. He did not resist. He asked whether he could move his car out of the sun. On the 9th of December, an Aubrey County grand jury returned a 23-count indictment, engaging in a pattern of corrupt activity, 12 counts of theft from a person in a protected class, which in Ohio is what they call stealing from somebody over 65, and which carries more time than stealing from anybody else, and I want every person watching to know that law exists. 4 counts of tampering with records, 3 counts of forgery, 2 counts of telecommunications fraud, 1 count of perjury, as an aider and abettor, for the affidavit he put in front of my wife. On the 4th of March, he pled guilty to 16 of them. He was sentenced to 11 years in a state institution and ordered to pay restitution of $2,940,000, which he does not have and will never have, at a rate the court set at $400 a month, which means the Kirkendall family will be receiving checks until the year 2638. Meridian Anchor, LLC, surrendered its Ohio registration and was wound up in receivership. Its 12 deeds were set aside in a consolidated quiet title action in the Aubrey County Court of Common Pleas, filed on the 12th of November and decided on the 18th of February, and every one of those 12 properties went back into the names it had come out of. 1114 Bellamy Street is in the names Silas J. Redmond and Nell E. Redmond, husband and wife, as it has been since the 9th of June 1979, and the parcel number in the tract index reads 410814100072, which Ruth Ann Spratt corrected herself, by hand, on a Tuesday. Pallister Capital, whose lawyers were faster than anybody's, established a settlement fund of $1,100,000 for the 12 households rather than be a defendant, and did not admit anything, and I have decided to be at peace with that, because Cleo Tunney got $206,000 out of it, and she is back at 418 Coburn Street. Fairhaven Legacy Partners is a name on a dissolved filing. Its client list, which ran to 230 households in 5 counties, was turned over to the Ohio Attorney General's Elder Protection Unit, and there are 3 more prosecutions pending in 2 counties that I am not permitted to describe. Kip Danner surrendered his real estate license voluntarily and took a job at his father-in-law's HVAC company. He wrote me a 2-page letter by hand. I wrote him back and told him he was 38, and that 38 is not a life sentence. Delia Trombley received a written reprimand from the Secretary of State's office for the manner of the mornings, which she deserved, and no further sanction, because she kept the second journal. She now works in the Aubrey County Recorder's office at the counter on the second floor, and Ruth Ann Spratt is teaching her the indexes. My daughter Dinah surrendered her escrow license for 18 months and testified for 4 hours in front of the grand jury without immunity, having been offered it and having told the prosecutor she would rather not have to say later that she had been paid for it. She and Junie moved into our back bedroom on the 17th of October and stayed until April. The divorce was final in May. And on the 28th of October, Lorna Pike at the Aubrey County Savings and Trust processed a home equity line of credit for $71,400 against 1114 Bellamy Street, secured by a house that 11 months of paperwork had failed to take. And on the 4th of November, at St. Casimir's Regional, a surgeon repaired my wife's mitral valve in 3 hours and 40 minutes. Our son Bram flew in on the 16th of October, slept on the couch for 3 weeks, drove his mother to the hospital at 5 in the morning on the 4th of November, and sat in that waiting room with his sister for 3 hours and 40 minutes, without once looking at his telephone. On the 9th of November, I drove to Gorse Loan and Jewelry on 5th Street with $640 and the interest, and a man behind the counter went in the back and came out with a thin yellow gold band with a garnet in it, and I put it on the kitchen table next to her pill organizer, which by then had every compartment full. The house paid for it. The house he wanted paid for the thing he was willing to let her die without. Wardell Tunney is buried at Bethel Ridge. There was no fund started in his name, and no plaque put up, because that is not what Cleo wanted, and nobody asked her at first, and I have learned to ask. What she wanted was this. On the 14th of March, which would have been his 81st birthday, she opened the front windows of the house at 418 Coburn Street, and my wife sat down at the Tunney's old spinet piano with the sticking F and played for about 40 minutes with the windows open in March in Ohio. People came out, not for a ceremony. There was no ceremony. They came out onto their porches on Coburn Street, the way people do when they hear a piano, and they stood there in their coats. And when she finished, a man across the street clapped once and then stopped, because he did not know if you were supposed to. That is the only memorial Wardell Tunney has, and I think it is the correct size. Now let me tell you the part I actually keep. 6 weeks after the operation, on a Tuesday in the middle of December, I came down at 10 to 7, and my wife was standing at the window over the sink in her blue robe, looking at the driveway. I stopped in the doorway. I will be honest, my heart went sideways, and Nell said, without turning around, "Silas, that porch light has been on all night again." I said, "Yes." She said, "Every night. I've been watching it come on at 4 in the afternoon, and I have not said a word for a month, but that's the bill, and it's got to stop." That is all she said. She said it in the exact voice she has used about the porch light, and the storm windows, and the ice maker, for 48 years. A voice with no fear in it at all. A woman with nothing in the world on her mind, but $11 of electricity. I had been leaving that light burning since the 8th of September, so that if she ever came home in the dark, or was brought home in the dark, the house would not be dark. I did not tell her that. I sat down on a kitchen chair and put my hands over my face and cried where she could see me, which I have done twice in 50 years. And she came over and put her hand on the back of my neck and did not ask me a single question. And after a while she said, all right, old man. There is a thing they used to say about a lion at the end of his life, that he is slow, that his teeth are worn, that he stays at the back of the grass and lets the young ones go first, and that this is the point at which you may safely stop watching him. Every animal on that plain knows better. And I will tell you what I know. After 41 years of writing down what other people said, and one autumn of finally saying something myself, they did not lose because I was clever. They lost because they were sure that a quiet man is an empty one, and because when they handed an old typist a stack of tape, they never once considered that he would play it all the way to the end. If you are watching this tonight, and somebody in your family has started explaining your own life to you in a patient voice, do not argue with them. Just start writing it down. Dates, times, exact words. A quiet page is the loudest thing you will ever own. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And stay with me here, at Old Lion Stories. The porch light is off now. It has been off since December. And every single night that I reach over and turn it off, I check the driveway first. And my wife is in the house. And I am the one who gets to lock the door.